Well, if we keep going at this rate all the way until next fall, I don't know if I'll ever have to come back to the church. We'll have enough teaching to last you for a long time. Well, several people have already said to me they're kind of looking forward to it because maybe more had thought that and didn't say it to me, because it can be a time for reviewing a lot of things that happen. Well, I don't know. Maybe I'll disappoint you or surprise you and be back too often then. But time will tell about that. Hallelujah. Someone else said maybe we can just pick a different brother every time we meet, and he can stand up and review some teaching that we've had earlier. Well, that would be interesting. Take that study of creation. Well, you wouldn't be expected to teach, just kind of review. Just review. Take the study of creation and then just assign every brother in here, whoever wants to anyway. Hopefully it wouldn't be just one person that taught the whole series again. And with a message, stand up and say, this is what we learned, and go over all of that again. Well, it just make you remember those things a little better, call all that back to your mind. And it wouldn't be someone like me up here who just goes on and on and on and on about it. It would be someone who basically knows about the same thing. Say, well, what would the purpose be? I could learn it at home. Well, you can, but do you really, though? Do you really have the time to jump into all those at home? But maybe someone could stand up here and do that. Well, let's look at our outline before I get wound up tonight on this new topic. I finally brought mine with me since we're finally off of the Apocrypha. Page 11, Introduction to Biblical and Extra-Biblical Literature. Page 11. You see down at the bottom, fundamental objections to the Apocrypha. That's what we went over the last time. The opinion of Jewry, inspiration. They don't say, thus saith the Lord. The chronology, and so forth. Opinion of the Eastern Church, which we didn't agree with that one too much. Literary style, which is an interesting one. New Testament references, apostolic opinion, and Jesus' opinion. Before you turn, though, go back to page 10, the top of the page, uninspired writings. Then you see A, Old Testament, then one underneath that, Apocrypha, and then, if you'll turn to page 12, because see there's a big break between 1 and 2. 1 is Apocrypha, and you see 2 up there as other books, and then A was Old Testament, and then B becomes New Testament. So we're going to be under that number 2 for a few weeks. I just summed it all up there as other books. So that's where we are if you want to know where we are. Very top line on page 12, other books. What other books? Well, such things as the Midrashim, the Talmud, and the Targumim. Tonight we're going to try to just summarize a whole deal of material. As a matter of fact, it can be a lifetime study in itself just to comprehend all these fanciful Jewish notions and writings. And because it's not as well known, has not exerted the type of influence as has the Apocrypha, then I don't think it's as necessary to spend that much time on it. We've been on the Apocrypha for a long time. We've been right here in Biblical Lit since January of 83, and it's almost January of 86, so it's been almost 3 years just in this class. So tonight we're going to take as our topic the Midrashim, M-I-D-R-A-S-H-I-M. You're accustomed to hearing Hebrew pronunciation, so you could probably spell that yourself. Midrashim, the ancient Jewish Midrashim. And then I believe the next thing we'll look at will be the Talmud, and then the Targumim. These are various oral traditions and writings. The Midrashim, the Talmud, and the Targumim are various oral traditions and writings that have to do with the Old Testament in either Hebrew or Aramaic. And it can become quite confusing. If you think the Apocrypha was confusing, remembering all the names of the books and the dates and outlines for each book and what's going on, if you think that was confusing, you really wouldn't want to get into much more detail than what we're going to do tonight with the Midrashim. In the first place, you'd have to be able to read Hebrew fairly well to be able to even get into it, because it's not available so much in English, because it's not nearly as important as has been the Apocrypha, as I've already mentioned. And it can become so tedious. As I said before, it's a lifetime study in itself. And to really understand it, I don't know all there is to know about this, because to really understand this, like some scholars do, it would take up your whole life just studying the various intricacies of the Midrashim. To begin with, let me show you kind of what, it's not just something that's so out in left field so that someone could then raise the question, well, why would we even waste our time with it? Because there is interplay in the New Testament with the Midrashim. So let's begin by looking at that to satisfy everyone's idea of whether or not we should take the time out tonight to study this briefly. Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 to 9. It's parallel over in Mark 7, but we'll stay here. Matthew 15. And I know it's something that you've read before, but we're going to show you the literal technical base behind all of this. It's not just a general term as we use the term. What term? Well, you'll see what I'm talking about as you turn over there. Matthew 15, verses 1 to 9. But I mean, this is not going to help your spiritual growth at all, this study tonight, because I mean, it's just way out there in technical Jewish matters. So you just have to kind of learn it to be learning it. Then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees. Now, later on in intertestamental period, we'll get to a lengthy discussion of scribes and Pharisees and all the rest of those groups, so you'll understand something more about that than just the name. Which were of Jerusalem, saying, Why do thy disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread. But he answered and said unto them, Why do ye also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? For God commanded, saying, Honor thy father and thy mother, and he that curseth father or another or mother, let him die the death. But ye say, Whosoever shall say unto his father or to his mother, It is a gift, by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, and honor not his father or his mother. I'm a little more used to the Markan account, and it has the transliterated Hebrew term in there as korban, and not just as gift here. He shall be free. Thus have ye made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. Ye hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, This people draweth nigh unto me with their mouth, and honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Because in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Zeroing in, therefore, on this second verse, why do thy disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? Then we see the connection between the Midrashim and the gospel accounts. This is not just a reference to, well, you know how we could use the word, and we did use the word Wednesday night in the second teaching Wednesday night of tradition, just in a general sense, various things that come up. The tradition of the elders was a codified body of literature. It began around this time, or a little before this time, quite a bit before this time, and it had all been passed down orally. But it wasn't something that you could bend one way or the other. It was not flexible at all. It was very technical, very precise, very definite, and it was known as the tradition of the elders. Or another name of that would be the Midrashim. These various traditions that the scribes before had passed down. And they were based on a false understanding of the text. For instance, the book of Exodus, chapter 30 and verse 19, would be their alleged basis, according to the Midrashim, for this commandment that Christ's disciples have broken in Matthew 15:2, and that is the failure to wash one's hands before they ate bread. Now, if you look over there in Exodus chapter 30 and verse 19, I believe I know what it says. I can more or less quote it to you. Something along the line that Aaron and his sons shall wash their hands and their feet thereat, at the laver that's mentioned in the verse prior to that. Aaron and his sons shall wash their hands and their feet thereat. I mean, it was a ceremonial service and a cleansing, and these were priests. And now they have, by their Midrashim exegesis, built upon that and formulated this doctrine that no one could eat. And we're not talking about priests now, we're not talking about ceremonies or the sanctuary, but no one could eat without washing one's hands. And it was not for purposes of hygiene, it was for religious purposes. And that's what Jesus has a problem with as far as his understanding is concerned. Jesus is not saying that it'd be a great sign of one's great advanced maturity just to go to the table as grubby as possible. That's not what he means here. But washing one's hands, although it might have some hygienic basis behind it, for us, it shouldn't have a religious basis behind it. And it doesn't in the Old Testament, but it does in the Midrashim. And so you have, in other words, what I'm saying is you have to understand the teaching of the Midrashim to understand really what's going on here in the Gospel account. And thus is true many places in the Gospels where the traditions of the scribes and the elders and the fathers who have come before have been handed down, and the teaching and the practice of Jesus is rubbing contrary to that. Remember, they're accusing him many times of breaking the law of Moses. But did he break the law of Moses? No. He broke their interpretation of the law of Moses. He didn't break the law. He came to keep the law. He was a fulfiller of the law. But all left and right, he broke their superficial view of what Moses had taught. And that's what presents them with so many problems concerning him. So there's an initial example just to show you that it is worth taking a little bit of time out to look at, because to understand the Gospels, you're going to have to understand something about the Midrashim. Okay, let's deal with the word to begin with. Midrash, it's generally just pronounced in English as the Midrash. It's easier to say than Midrash. The Midrash, the Midrashim. It comes from a verb D, long A, R, short A, S-H. Darash, which means to seek, to search, or to examine. To seek, to search, or to examine. And it's an important verb in the Hebrew Old Testament. If you want to know more about it, it's number 1875 in BDB Lexicon. So I won't spend any more time on that. I think that's page 205, but that's just relying on memory. Darash, the verb which means to seek, to search, or to examine. And then it has another verb that derives itself from this verb. That is where we really get our term. M-I-D, Shva, R, long A, S-H. And how would you pronounce that? Midrash. That's the word we're talking about. Midrash. So midrash is a verb that is a derivative of darash. And midrash means to seek with care. It's a more diligent form of seek than just darash. Midrash. It means to seek with care. Whenever we do a brief word study like this, we have to give you the word, we have to give you what it means, and then we have to give you references to show you how that's used. Leviticus 10:16. After Nadab and Abihu have attempted to offer strange fire before the Lord and they have been killed, then we're told that Moses in Leviticus 10:16 he sought diligently the goat of the sin offering. And what had happened? Well, it had already been destroyed, and so he's mad at the two remaining sons of Aaron. Leviticus 10:16. In 2 Samuel 11:3, after David has noticed the beauty of Bathsheba, then he sought diligently as to whose wife she was. To whom did she belong? 2 Samuel 11:3. So it's to seek diligently, or to seek with care. And finally, Isaiah 11:10. A millennial prophecy that says that the Gentiles in the millennium will diligently seek Christ. They will seek after the Lord. Isaiah 11:10. So this in its verbal form, which is this form, midrash, appears 164 times. See, I just gave you 3 references. 164 times in the Old Testament. Twice it appears in a substantive form, which means the form of a noun. Twice it appears, and this we really need to look at. We're building to understand exactly what we mean when we say the midrash or the midrashim. Twice it appears in a substantive form, both of these in 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles chapter 13, verses 21 and 22. And we'll read each of these. And chapter 24 and verse 27. Chapter 24 and verse 27. Passages we've used a long time ago, back in the earlier portion of this class. Remember, whenever we studied the lost books of the Bible, these passages came into play. But Abijah waxed mighty, married 14 wives. Well, he would have to be. Begat 22 sons and 16 daughters. You're slow tonight. The rest of the acts of Abijah and his ways and his sayings are written in and we have a noun here that is a derivative of midrash, the story of the prophet Iddo. Now it can mean story, and as a matter of fact, the underlying meaning is closer to story, but the word really should be translated a commentary. A commentary. It's a commentary that tells a running story, though. But if you look this up in your Hebrew Bibles, those of you who have that, then you'll see what I'm talking about. We have a noun here that derives itself from midrash. Then over in chapter, and it should be translated a commentary, 24 and verse 27. Now concerning his sons and the greatness of the burdens laid upon him, the repairing of the house of God, behold, they are written in the commentary of the book of Kings. Now Amaziah, his son, reigned in his stead. We've looked at both of those words before. So now we've gone from the verb darash, to seek, search, or examine, to a derivative of a verb, midrash, which means to seek with care, to the substantive form, which means a commentary. All of that's important, but the commentary aspect gets us closer to understanding what we want to talk about tonight. Regardless of really what the words mean in the Bible, the basis for the midrashim is not that this word occurs in X number of places in the Bible or in X place in the Bible. So we're really not too much concerned with the word as it appears in the Bible as a verb or as a noun, but rather with its post-biblical technical usage by the Jewish rabbis. Post-biblical, we mean after Malachi's time. We're concerned about its post-biblical technical usage, where it came to mean a commentary. Hence the importance of our looking at 2 Chronicles 13:22 and chapter 24 and verse 27. So let me give you a one-sentence definition of what I'm talking about by the midrashim. The midrash is a formal, technical exposition of, or a rabbinic commentary on, the Old Testament in Hebrew and Aramaic. in Hebrew and Aramaic. The Midrashim in their written form flourished between 100 BC and AD 300. However, that's only the written form. They began much earlier. Some have suggested as early as the time of Ezra, the first of the great scribes of the so-called Great Synagogue of Israel. And in their oral form, they go back, if not that far, at least to 400 BC. So their oral form would be from maybe 400 to 100 BC, and their written form from 100 BC to AD 300. You understand what I'm saying there? That these were expositions, but they were passed down orally. They existed 300, let's say 250 BC they existed, but they didn't exist in a written form yet. It was only oral. But all these traditions, all of these marks of commentary upon the Old Testament that existed in Hebrew or Aramaic, depending on who you were and where you were, these existed then, and they were binding on the people. By the time of the New Testament, they are equated, as far as their authority is concerned, they are equated with the law of Moses and the prophets as well. That's how important they have become by the time of Jesus and the teaching of the apostles. So it's kind of like what we've studied in the intertestamental period before. Here's something else that you have to know that's going on when? Between the testaments. To understand why you don't find, in other words, back in the Old Testament, there are not many references to the tradition of the elders because they didn't have traditions. They believed the law of Moses and the prophets. But you know when you open up the Gospels, these rascals of the rabbis and the scribes, the lawyers, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they have 101 little petty doctrines that aren't supported in the Word of God. And yet they bring them on the people. There are these binding burdens over there in Matthew 23 and bind the people with those things. And they are burdens because they are taking liberties with the text, either of the teaching in the books of Moses or those of the prophets. But by the 1st century AD, they are accounted great authority. Great weight is given to them. And so for Jesus to come along and contradict one of these sacred beliefs of the elders, been passed down from at least 400 BC, and now it's in written form, well, that was a major sin as far as they were concerned. The typical Midrash is divided up into two sections. The typical Midrash. A Midrash is one. A Midrashim is the plurality of them. But the Midrash would be divided up into two sections. First of all, we have what was known as the Halakha, Halakah, the Halakha, which meant the rule to go by. Comes from this verb, halach, which in Hebrew is just the verb to go. Halach is the verb to go. The halakha would then mean the rule to go by. And I'm going to explain which each of these, what each of these halves mean. The first, the halakha, deals with the Torah, and then the Haggadah will deal with the Nevi'im. This is an exposition in an ethical and doctrinal fashion of the Torah. So you're getting to practice Hebrew during the week as well. Amen. You can write your Hebrew and pronounce along with us, and you know what the Torah is, the law of Moses. Genesis through Deuteronomy. An exposition in an ethical and doctrinal fashion. By the way, each of these halves, though, still fit the overall definition of the formal technical exposition of or rabbinic commentary on the Old Testament in Hebrew and Aramaic. But this half of it, the halakha, it deals with the legal aspect, in other words, of the Old Testament. That's another way to say it. It deals with the legal aspect, the legal parts, whereas the second half will deal with all that is non-legal. That is, all that comes after the Torah. They would use such things as analogy, the rabbis, analogy, combination, common analogy, that is, they'd take one passage, for instance, that they didn't really understand. They would try to find an analogy somewhere else in the law of Moses and thereby explain the first text they couldn't understand. Or they'd use the method of combination. Now, there were a couple of things they couldn't understand, but there were several things they could. And they'd try to combine things they did understand to help explain something that they didn't understand. So, by means of analogy and combination, they try to decipher the deeper meanings of the law. You know, in cases that really had not been specifically spoken of or about. This is something we haven't covered that much in this church, and you're probably not that aware of it. Some of what happened, obviously the Midrashim would have been false, but some of what happened would have been true. What's another way I can say? It was trying to make, this maybe is a better way to explain what I'm trying to get you to understand. What they were trying to do was to make contemporary the ancient law of Moses. It had spoken of things such as certain things that by nature could only have taken place in the wilderness wandering. It can only have taken place then. Okay, what about when you get established in the land? Well, you say some of the law deals with that. Well, that's true. But what about events 200 BC that just would not have occurred by nature of chronology 1400 BC, such as these inroads of the spirit of Hellenism around this time? Then how can the law of Moses, which is so antiquated, really deal in these contemporary matters as we need them to deal? Well, they felt, and they were right in some cases, that an issue simply could not be found back. That issue could simply not be found back in the law of Moses. You're going to have to do some hopscotching around to draw some things together to get an understanding of it. And so in attempting to make the law of Moses contemporary for their times, then they would look by analogy and by combinations and so forth, they would look for a deeper meaning somewhere hidden in the law that then they could lift out and that would speak to their own time period. Sound familiar? I mean, it goes on all the time. And this had all become codified and very formal and very technical as far as the Jews were concerned, especially as far as the leaders were concerned. They couldn't, and you couldn't even hope for the common Jew to remember all these things or comprehend all these things. It was enough to know the law and to know your Old Testament. But the rabbis, they sat around burning both ends of the candle, just talking and talking and talking, and really trying to understand what's going on here in the law of Moses and how we can make this contemporary with our times. So there's the first half, a halakha, the rule to go by. The rule to go by in legal matters is based on our exposition and our commentary upon the Torah. Then the second half was known as the Haggadah. The Haggadah, H-A-G-G-A-D-A-H, which comes from the verb hugad. Hugad. H-U-G-A-D, hugad, which means it was said. And so the Haggadah was that which was said or that which was reported. The halakha is a rule to go by. The Haggadah, how many of you have ever heard of these terms before? The Haggadah is that which is said or reported. Okay, and I've already told you a little bit of what this would deal with. If the halakha deals with the legal parts, then the Haggadah deals with the non-legal parts of the Old Testament. So let me give you a little definition of this, as I did with halakha. The halakha, the first aspect, was an exposition in an ethical and doctrinal fashion of the Torah. The Haggadah is an exposition of the entire Old Testament outside the Torah. So for them, that would be the Nevi'im, the prophets. And here's another place where we see a twofold division of the Old Testament. The law, the Torah, and the prophets, the Nevi'im. And the Haggadah was more homiletical and devotional. More homiletical and devotional. in nature. Preaching material, in other words, was preaching material, meditating material, and not the deep study material of the legal aspects of the Torah. So then, let me give you some examples of the Midrashim, just a few over the centuries. Many examples. But these are some of popular examples of the Midrashim. First of all, we have the Midrash of Rabbi Eliezer. Which dates around AD 70. It dates around AD 70. This was a 54-section discussion of the chief events of the law. So this was a midrash in the halakha form. A 54-section discussion of the chief events in the law that was first published in the year 1514 in Constantinople. 1514 in Constantinople. But I'm saying it existed in written form as early as the time of Rabbi Eliezer, AD 70. Of course, some go earlier than this. We said you've got to go back to 100 BC to get probably the beginning of the period of the written form of the Midrashim. One example, see, this doesn't mean a whole lot to you, but it'll just make your notes a little more complete so you'll understand a little more what I'm talking about. And we'll still get into it, explain it, and then we'll try to practice a little bit on the Old Testament, and that will even show you better. Then we have the Midrash Rabot. The Midrash Rabot. R-A-B-B-O-T, or you probably remember from our studies in Hebrew, generally a T is given as a TH today. The Taw, not a Taw. Rabot, R-A-B-B-O-T-H. A.D. 270. And this isn't just one Midrash, this is a combination of 10 Midrashim. Some that are halakha in nature, some that are haggadah in nature. First published in Venice in 1545. And then in the third place, another example of the Midrashim would be the Pesita, P-E-S-I-K-T-A. You can even probably practice and write it in Hebrew, P-E-S-I-K-T-A, Pesita. A.D. 380. This was a cycle of lectures that cover the feasts and the fasts in the Old Testament. And it wasn't published until the early 19th century. Okay, remember what I'm giving you here, these devotional and doctrinal paraphrases. Some of them are unbelievably fanciful in nature. What I'm giving you is just the written form. Remember that they were first developed orally. Now this is going to become important when we discuss the Targumim later on once we get through the Talmud. That there was an oral phase to these various beliefs of the Jews passed down century after century after century. And then finally, because you see each rabbi that would come on the scene would then go back to the Old Testament and he would have a certain school of disciples that followed him. This is the whole basis of Christ's ministry. What was he? He was a teacher, a rabbi, who had a group of disciples, a nucleus of followers that went everywhere he went, that sat at his feet, and he taught them. Now we're back to what we discussed earlier whenever we were teaching on the model prayer and the Jewishness of it. People, conservatives, lay evangelicals, don't realize how much of the life and the teaching and the ministry of Christ is patterned after what's going on during his period of time. That's why to a certain extent and degree, we today are allowed to pattern ourselves after the common form and method of teaching. We're back to the Wednesday night teaching now. That's why we don't sit cross-legged like a Buddhist priest or something, because that's not what people do around here. Now, if that was the way they taught, that's the way I'd teach then. You'd conform in certain areas to contemporary times. Preachers today generally stand behind a pulpit, do they not? They wear garb, some of them, do they not? Those that don't wear a suit, do they not? And then they preach and people listen, so we conform more or less to that. Jesus came on the scene. This wasn't a new invention to go and pick out some disciples and say, follow me. The other rabbis did that. Paul sat at the feet of Gamaliel, remember? Gamaliel was his rabbi teacher, taught Paul for a number of years. Gamaliel was a famous first century A.D. rabbi. Well, there were two earlier rabbis that came like 20 B.C. and lived up to the time of Christ, up into his life a little bit. I think one died a little bit before that were famous rabbis that were doing essentially the same thing that Jesus was doing. But as I was going to say, they would come on the scene every time a new rabbi would come on the scene, a new important rabbi, a chief rabbi. He'd go back to the law, he'd go back to the prophets, the Nevi'im, and he'd build a little bit of his exposition and commentary upon that and pass that down to his disciples. But listen, it got to be so much who could possibly remember all of that. And thus we have the need to have it written down in a codified written form. So what I've given you here are just examples of the written form. You notice that they don't date any earlier than AD 70. So remember that the oral form goes back almost 200 years earlier. The oral form was the important form because that's what gave birth to the written form. In the oral presentation, there were several different devices used by the trained rabbinic speaker, such as the following. This was in the oral presentation, and then we'll continue our discussion of the written presentation of the Midrashim. The earlier oral presentation, there were several different devices used by the trained rabbinic speaker, and obviously it'd be for the purpose of holding the people's attention because it was quite boring, the material, and helping them, trying to help them remember at least a little bit of it. Okay, first of all, you listen to these things, and your mind ought to start thinking about the Gospels. We're trying to enlighten you in the critical thinking sense of the matter to understand more of what's going on in the New Testament. This isn't just Jesus coming down from heaven and everything's just done straight from heaven. He's borrowing things around him. When you understand that, then you can better understand what our possibilities would be today. Do you just have to be so totally different from everyone as to not even resemble them? Well, that wasn't true in Jesus' ministry. Wasn't true in Paul's. Paul knew the place to teach most Jews is the synagogue, right? So whenever he'd go into a town, he wasn't just a renegade. He'd go into the synagogue. Go in on the right day, catch the Jews already at a time of worship, and preach Christ from the Old Testament to them. Now that only makes sense. Why? See, I'm going to be so different from everyone, they're not even going to recognize me. Well, that would have been fine, but no one would have gotten converted then under Paul's ministry. So he had to go where the people were, and he had to reach the people in their own ways. One interesting method of teaching was a theme would be set forth by reading a certain passage and commenting upon it, and mentioning through this passage the truth that you desire to speak about, and then they would illustrate it with a proverb or a parable or some common saying among the people. So we have the origin of teaching by means of parables and proverbs and common sayings of the people. A theme would be set forth through the reading of a passage. If it was halakha, it'd be in the law. If it was haggadah, it'd be in the Nevi'im. And then you'd comment upon it, and you'd mention the particular truth you want to draw from that. I mean, if I just read to you John 3:16, well, there are many truths there. Which truth do I want you to know that we're going to begin speaking about? I'd have to let you know what truth. And then the next step for the trained rabbinic speaker would be to use a parable. or a proverb or some common saying that would perk the people's ears up, bring them to attention, and help them better to comprehend and then to remember what you're talking about. Of course, remember what we said in that message on the model prayer, that you can't go overboard as the critical scholars do. They're trying to destroy the uniqueness of Christ in his ministry and teaching by saying everything he did, he copied from someone else. We read in Matthew 13, Jesus told his disciples, I speak in parables so that they will not understand me. Now that's just a reverse of the way parables were used in that day. You spoke in parables to help excite the people's attention. They'd get excited. Oh, we've got a parable, a proverb. Everyone likes to hear a riddle, or a joke, see if you can get the answer to it. Everyone likes to hear that. So Jesus is using the same method, but Jesus, the uniqueness of his use of it is that it was for a different reason. He said, I'm using parables so that only the elect can understand what I'm talking about. Oh, you can get into deep studies in the area I'm talking about right now. And you really have to, or you end up back in that first camp of naivete and supernaturalism whenever you read the Gospels. You really don't know what's going on there. Another tactic that could be used would be the slipping into your sermon of a foreign word, like a Latin or a Greek or a Persian term. See, if you didn't know Hebrew, as soon as I would say halakha, well, your ears would perk up. I've never heard that before. It arouses one's interest. Even though you don't know anything what's going on, you don't know in the world what's being said by that term, the Midrashim. If you don't know anything about Hebrew, you don't even know how Hebrew words are pronounced and enunciated. It at least would arouse interest in the congregation. This, therefore, accounts for the large number of foreign words in the Midrashim. Even when there is an appropriate Hebrew word or an Aramaic one that would equally fit in the same place. Even when that's true, we still find Persian, Greek, and Latin terms, because this would incite the people to listen more closely. Now we could turn through the Gospels and see this in their written form, the way they've been written, not so much in the spoken form, because we don't have the spoken form, just the written form. But let's take something that we've dealt with recently. You see again how all these teachings are tying together, and they're not by my plan or my scheme that all these tie together. You have to have heard what was going on before and somehow make a connection between that and what we're talking about now. But what about Romans 8, Galatians 4? Twice we see in the New Testament the early church, at least the Apostle Paul, picked up Jesus' use of that Aramaic term Abba for father. Now when you're reading along in Galatians or in Galatians 4, Romans 8, you hit that word Abba and what happens? You stop. If you've never read it before, you know what father means. You know what the Spirit and the suffering and the glory and manifestation. You know all those English words, but Abba? What's Abba mean? So you see the throwing in of a foreign term stops a person, gets your attention, causes you to think about what's being said. So you see, nothing's unscriptural with all of this. It was a good method of teaching. It still is a good method of teaching. Then in the third place, still talking about the oral delivery of the Midrashim, the speaker would point out analogies between numbers and persons in the story or the commentary that he was delivering. Remember, the commentary is really a running story. He would point out analogies between numbers and persons. All Hebrew letters represent a certain number, remember. Hebrew letters represent a certain number. And so here they'd get a little mystical on us. And let's take the name David. They'd take those letters and determine what numbers are being spoken here. And then they'd come up with some deeper meaning there about David, or about David in that passage.